That this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. If this government was serious about tackling corruption, we'd have a national anti-corruption commission, a national ICAC, a national corruption watchdog, like they have in New South Wales. Because this government thinks that the only place that wrongdoing happens is on one side of the fence in the industrial arena. They are kidding themselves, and people across the country do not believe that either. Anyone who thinks that there is not corruption taking place amongst Australia's biggest corporations can only be turning a blind eye, which is what this government does. Under this government's watch, we've had report after report of some of Australia's biggest companies using money to bribe overseas regimes like Saddam Hussein, bribing Saddam Hussein's regime in order to get a contract. We've had reports going on over a long period of time that subsidiaries in the Reserve Bank paid money to individuals overseas in order to secure deals. All of that happening under the federal government's watch. And as everyone knows, at the state level in New South Wales, when broad-based national anti-corruption commissions have the power to go and look under every rock, not just on one particular side of the political fence, but across the board, then they find that there are Liberal MPs and that there are Labor MPs who've not just had their snouts in the trough, but have actually been on the take. And some of them have rightly been prosecuted, and they've been prosecuted. That is what you get when you have a proper national anti-corruption commission. And that's why I'm moving an amendment that all the words after whilst be omitted, with a view to substituting the following words. The bill contains some improvements to the existing law. They are not enough, and the House declines to give the bill a second reading and calls on the government to establish a national independent commission against corruption. We've got an opportunity here in this parliament to do what they've done in New South Wales and what the Australian people want, and that is establish a national anti-corruption commission. A body that has the power to go and look under every rock at the federal level in the same way that they do at the New South Wales level. So that body would have the power to investigate what the government says is its motivation for this bill, which is if there's wrongdoing in the union movement. And if there is wrongdoing in the union movement, if there is corruption, then of course it doesn't matter where it happens, it should be rooted out and people should be brought before the courts and prosecuted, and if they're found guilty, they do their time or pay the penalty. But the point is that in Australia, we are meant to have equality before the law. We're meant to have a system of laws in Australia where no one is exempt from the law, no matter how high an office they hold, and where if you're on the take and receiving corrupting benefits, then it doesn't matter what position in society you hold, you should be brought to account. And what they found in New South Wales is that when you start looking, you find things. Now, there's been an argument put by some that says we don't need a national anti-corruption commission at the federal level because there's been no suggestion of corruption by federal MPs or federal public servants or others who have dealings with the Commonwealth. Well, Mr Speaker, in some ways that's the point. You don't know what's there unless you have a body that's got the power to look. And if you have a body that has the power to look, then that's when the public starts to know exactly what is going on behind closed doors. Now, we know that there has been, because we've heard the allegations, that within subsidiaries of federal government bodies, like the Reserve Bank, there have been long-standing accusations of improper payments being made, the kind of payments that you'd think that this government would be concerned about given this bill. Now, there's been some limited attempts to investigate that. And I, for one, have been part of parliamentary committees that have tried to get to the bottom of that. And what you find when you start looking and start investigating is that a parliamentary committee is no substitute for a well-resourced watchdog that has the power to go in, get the documents, ask the tough questions and do the investigation that can then come up with the evidence that can then be handed over to prosecutors. Now, what is the justification for saying corrupting benefits have got to be outlawed for one particular group in society, but it's apparently okay everywhere else? It's bad if you're a union, but it's all right if you're one of Australia's largest corporations, or it's all right if you're a subsidiary of the Reserve Bank, or it's all right if you are a senior official within the Commonwealth. There can be no justification for saying that. So, here's a challenge to the government. If everything that you've said is what you genuinely believe, then expand this bill so that it becomes the start of a proper national commission against corruption, a national anti-corruption watchdog. But what I suspect is that the government doesn't actually care about corruption at all. The government turns a blind eye to it. For this government, if you've got a blue collar, they throw the book at you, but if you've got a white collar, they turn the blind eye. We've had accusation after accusation of wrongdoing at the top levels of the corporate sector, and this government does nothing about it. And when you delve into the provisions of this bill, it shows that this is nothing more than a political stunt, because the provisions of this bill are strict liability provisions and make it very, very difficult to very easy to prosecute, and they come with very harsh penalties of jail time. But the provisions are so incredibly broad that the likes of the Law Council have said they do not have a place in a country governed by the rule of law. So to take an example, and I know that there's not many on the government side of the House who've ever spent a day standing up for Australian workers in their life, so this might come as news to them as to how you actually do it. But what would happen? What would happen if a union has been involved in a big industrial dispute with an employer and then says at the conclusion of that dispute, or partway through that dispute that's involved going to court, involved the expenditure of a huge amount of legal fees, what if they say, we'll settle this dispute and we'll put it all behind us, but we want you to pay our legal fees as part of that? Is that caught by this law? Maybe. Maybe that's caught by this law. Who knows? The provisions of this law are so broad that the legitimate day-to-day activity that takes place between employers and employees and their representatives is now all under a cloud. But that's probably not surprising, because that's exactly the government's intent. The government's intent has nothing to do with increasing the application of the rule of law in Australia, and everything to do with using the power of this place to pick a political fight, to pick certain sides of the political fence and say, well, we don't like what you're doing because sometimes you come and campaign against us in elections when we try and take your rights, the rights of Australian workers away. We don't like that. So we're going to put restrictions on you that we would never dream of putting on our friends at the top end of town in the corporate sector. That's what this is about, and make no mistake. And it's for that reason, because this bill is drafted so broadly and makes it so difficult for people to conduct what would otherwise be lawful activity, that I won't be supporting it, but also because it is crystal clear that the government is passing up the opportunity to establish a national anti-corruption watchdog that is broad-based, that this cannot be supported. So here's an invitation to the government. Take this bill away, start again, and come back with a bill that is applied to everyone in society, including all of us here in Parliament. Come back with a bill that is a national anti-corruption commission and a watchdog, so that every one of us here in Parliament is put under the same level of scrutiny and obligation as you want to apply to unions. Come back with a bill that puts companies and the biggest corporations in this country under the same level of scrutiny, that puts our top public servants, people who work in the tax office, under the same level of obligation and scrutiny as you want to apply here to unions. And I bet the government won't. I bet the government won't, but I hope they do. I hope they do. And there's an opportunity now here with this amendment that I am moving for people of goodwill in this chamber to say, well, enough's enough. Enough's enough. We need to establish that National Anti-Corruption Commission. Because by supporting this amendment and telling the government to go back to the drawing board and coming up with something that applies the rule of law, but that applies it as equally to politicians and boardroom directors as it does to union officials, you'll be able to get some of these changes through. You might be able to get some of these changes through to deal with some of the concerns that you've raised. And as you'll see from the second reading amendment, we make the point that not only should people be held to account if they've done something that's wrong, but it's actually the Greens who've been leading the charge not only for a National Anti-Corruption Commission, but have been leading the charge into inquiring into why at Hungry Jack's and at McDonald's and at Coles and at Woolworths there are tens of thousands of people across the country who are young workers who are getting paid less than their award rates of pay. This is a good question. This is a very good question. Why is an 18-year-old who works Saturdays at McDonald's getting paid, or Sundays at McDonald's, or night shifts at Hungry Jack's or at Coles or at Woolies, getting paid less than what's in the award? That's a very good question. But we can fix that with a bill, and we've got a bill in Parliament to fix that, to stop the legal minimum conditions in this country from being undercut. If that's what you're really concerned, and I've heard a few government members refer to that in their speeches, if that's what you're really concerned about, let's fix it. Let's pass laws that make sure that young workers in this country are not done over. Let's make sure that every young worker in this country is entitled to be paid properly on weekends and at nights. So if you're serious about that, if that's your motivation for this bill, then get behind the Greens' pay protection bill, and then every parent who encourages their kid to go off and work at McDonald's or Coles or Woolies will know that they're getting paid properly, and every young person who works there will get paid their penalty rates for having to work those hours that are convenient for us when we all turn up on Sundays to be able to go to the supermarket, but are very inconvenient for the people who have to do it. So we could fix that. We could fix that. Let's fix it. If that's really your concern, then pass our bill that's in the Senate. But I suspect it's not. I suspect this government does not care one jot about the tens of thousands of underpaid retail and fast food workers around this country. I expect all the government cares about is using legislation for political points to try and beat up the Labor Party. And if you don't support our bill in the Senate to protect young workers, then everything that you've said here just counts for nothing. You're not actually cared. You don't actually care, government. You don't actually care about young workers. You don't actually care about people getting their penalty rates. You just want to use it as a political excuse. So, the test is now very clear. If the government supports this amendment, then this bill will be off the table and we can come back and have a discussion about what the Australian people want and what this place needs, which is a national anti-corruption watchdog. And I commend the amendment to the House.